Join me in the prayer for illumination. Holy Spirit, fill our hearts and minds as we read the Scriptures today. Help us to hear them in a new way. May our meditations and actions be acceptable to God, and may the peace of Christ be with us. Amen. So the reading this morning is from Deuteronomy, chapter 10, 12 through 21. A reading from the Hebrew Scriptures. Hear the words of the Lord. So now, O Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you? Only to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to keep the commandments of the Lord your God and his decrees that I am commanding you today for your own well-being. Although heaven and the heaven of heavens belong to the Lord your God, the earth with all that is in it, yet the Lord set his heart in love on your ancestors alone, and chose you and their descendants after them out of all of the peoples as it is today. Circumcise them the foreskin of your heart, and do not be stubborn any longer. For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, and the great God, mighty and awesome, who is not partial and takes no bribe, who executes justice for the orphan and the widow, who loves the strangers, providing them with food and clothing. You shall also love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall fear the Lord your God, him alone you shall worship. To him you shall hold fast, and by his name you shall swear. He is your praise, he is your God, who has done for you these great and awesome things that your own eyes have seen. The word of the Lord. Now,
morning comes to us from the Gospel according to Luke, the 14th chapter, beginning with the 7th verse. Listen to what the Spirit is saying to the community of faith this day. When he noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, he told them a parable. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down at the place of honor, in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host. And the host who invited both of you may come and say to you, give this person your place, and then in disgrace you would start to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down at the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher. Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Jesus said also to the one who had invited him, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return, and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. This is the word of the Lord. Long before any of us knew our ABCs, the alphabet, how to string those letters into words, how to read, we were still able to recognize certain symbols, interpreting them and making meaning. Before either of my children could read, they knew that a red bullseye meant target, and 2 yellow or golden arches meant McDonald's. But even more than that, they knew that a red bullseye meant the possibility of a treat, and that those arches meant a healthy and nutritious meal. That and Mom wasn't going to be home for dinner. From our earliest days, we are a people who seek out meaning. We sense and perceive the world around us, and we not only find ourselves wondering what things mean, asking ourselves why, but then once we feel we have a possible answer, we then need to create ways to express the meaning we have discovered to others. And long before we ever developed letters that combine to form words, we did that through symbols, and not just red bullseyes and golden arches. These symbols or signs did more than just stand for actual material and in some cases spiritual realities. They also acted as guideposts for how we were, how we are to live, and metaphors for the greatest mysteries of life itself. In the early 1900s, a gentleman by the name of Ferdinand de Saussure wrote a little book titled A Course in General Linguistics, in which he developed a new field of study called semiotics. Don't worry, I know that sounds trivial, but who knows? One day it might be an answer on Final Jeopardy, and you're going to owe me a lot of money. Semiotics broke down symbols, or what he referred to as signs, into a combination of a signifier and a signified. Going back to the familiar red bullseye, it would be the signifier. And a place where you buy 3 times as much as you initially intended would be the signified. Its meaning. Together, they are a sign. A red bullseye without a store full of stuff is just a red bullseye. It means nothing. Or at the very least, it means something entirely different. Where it starts to get even more confusing is when that first sign becomes a signifier signifying an entirely new and different sign. In the case of religion, the signifier of a cross signifies Christianity. but placed that Christian cross on top of a building, and now it signifies the Christian church. We live and move and have our being in a symbolic world of our own creation with some sort of historical and cultural consensus as to its meaning, as to the meaning of these signs, these symbols. Now look around you. Here in this sanctuary, we are surrounded by all sorts of signs and symbols that together tell a story, define our shared reality, and create meaning. The stained glass windows along the southern wall here are full of all sorts of signs that tell the story of Christian salvation history, from the Ten Commandments and the burning bush all the way to the culmination of all of time. But that story is also a sign of our identity, who we are as a people and what it is that we believe. The baptismal font is more than just a piece of furniture with a bowl and a pitcher. It is a sign of God's amazing grace and infinite love for us, of our belonging to God and our membership in the church. This is why in Roman Catholic churches you will find baptismal fonts when you first walk into the sanctuary, because it is by baptism that we each first entered the church, became members of the church, and it is a reminder of that baptism and God's love for us. For those very reasons, it might be worth considering doing that ourselves. But I fear that some people would become tribally Protestant and reject it out of hand simply because it's what the Catholics do. Lest we forget that we are all Christian, and more than that, we are all beloved children of God. I think I mentioned before that the cross on the back wall, the cross which has always been the central symbol of Christianity, could also be viewed as a star, the star of Bethlehem, signifying the birth of Jesus, the incarnation, a world suffused with divinity, the ordinary made holy. But the sign, the symbol that I really want to bring to our attention this morning, and that we will focus on throughout the month of October, is the table. And before we get too much farther down the theological road, let me be very clear. It is a table and not an altar. There are only a few things that distinguish Presbyterians from the vast majority of other Christians beyond saying debts and debtors in the Lord's Prayer. And that is that we have a table and not an altar. Why, you might ask? Well, it is because we believe that altars are where sacrifices take place. And since the death and resurrection of Jesus, the idea, the need for a sacrifice, and thus the need for a place to perform a sacrifice, is no longer necessary. And so we have a table. It was always interesting to me that one of our previous organists, Kendra Brodeen, herself a Lutheran married to a Lutheran pastor, would become almost apoplectic whenever Katie or I would set our coffee on the table. Because to her it was an altar, and you definitely don't put your coffee on the altar. Admittedly, sometimes I did it just for her reaction, which probably isn't something Jesus would do. But then again, had he seen the look on her face and how fast she could move, God only knows. So what does the table, this table as a symbol, signify for us? What does it mean to us? Most of us who were raised in the Christian faith were taught that it is a sign of the table that Jesus and the disciples gathered around in an upper room for their Last Supper together. In this way, it signifies a memory, and a very important memory. But is that its only meaning to us? The table is also a symbol of a great feast, of the heavenly banquet, of God's abundance and God's providential care. The early church, in association with the Lord's Supper, would gather around the table for times of food and fellowship, just like we do, though there is no mention of donuts. and these were often referred to as love feasts, were a shared or communal meal, somewhat like a present-day potluck. It also must be remembered as we think about the table's meaning, just how much of Jesus' ministry was done while sharing meals with those around him. The act of breaking bread as a way of letting people know that they were seen and heard and known and respected. The Wednesday and Thursday morning study groups are both currently reading a book titled A Bigger Table, Building Messy, Authentic, and Hopeful Spiritual Community by John Pavlovitz. The Wednesday evening group read it over the summer. Even if you don't come and join one of the groups, I highly recommend the book to anyone who is interested in the theme of community that we are exploring this fall. In the book, Pavlovitz writes of Jesus' table ministry. Most startling was the diversity of Jesus' table. He gathered with priests and prostitutes, with the religious elite and the common street rabble, with his disciples and with his adversaries. There at the big table, they were all treated with equal dignity, and they all left his presence with that dignity intact, even if he sometimes had harsh words for them. The table was, and I believe still is, a sign of the importance of community, diverse community, a community who, despite all of their differences, and they were great, were brought together around the same table by one thing: Jesus' invitation and welcome. That was the strategic beauty of his scandalously diverse guest list. By not being selective with his invitation, Jesus affirms the value of his disparate meal companions to them and to those watching from a distance. In a world where we so often are content to preach only to the choirs of those who agree with us, to wall ourselves off in a social media echo chamber of our amening cheerleaders, Jesus models a better way. He fully engages all sides and teaches them about one another in the process. For him, the table is a tool of connection. It transcends difference. It bridges disagreement. It declares the other welcome and worthy of hearing. It recognizes the other and declares commonality with him or her or them. In today's gospel reading, Jesus is taking on the social code of his day through a parable about a wedding banquet. In the first half of the parable, he gives what seems to be good advice. Don't think too highly of yourself. Be humble. Better to start from a lower position and be invited higher than place yourself ahead of others and be asked to move lower. The second half of the parable, however, is addressed not to those attending the banquet, but to those giving it, us. And it moves beyond good advice to something that might have sounded to his audience as fairly ridiculous and outrageous. Don't invite those in a position to do something for you, but rather invite those who cannot give you anything in return: the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. This past week in the Thursday morning group, the question was raised, what are the barriers to a bigger table in this congregation? One of the points of our conversation revolved around welcoming and including those people who are here because they need something. They need forgiveness. They need comfort. They need peace. They need to be in the presence of God to receive spiritual nourishment. They need to have somewhere to belong. They need somewhere they experience the love of God. They need to find community. But who perhaps at this moment in their lives have nothing to give in return. We want people to walk through the doors who will immediately teach Sunday school, take care of the gardens, serve coffee and usher, who will give generously of their financial resources. And if we are really, really fortunate, have a heating, ventilation, and cooling background. We have all sorts of room at our table for them. But what about the needy, the poor, the lost, the lonely, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, those who might just not only be able to give us anything in return, but actually need more from us? Our table must be big enough for all these people, all of us. And it is for all these reasons that I would argue that at least in this day and age, in this time and place, that we should at least consider the table and not the cross as the central symbol of our Christian faith. And if that is going to be the case, if that is going to be our case, our calling, then just like the character Brody said in the movie Jaws, I think we're going to need a bigger table. I might be paraphrasing that a little. For the next 4 Sundays, we will be celebrating the sacrament of communion together around the table, symbolizing our calling as God's beloved children to building diverse community. Over those same 4 Sundays, the table will change size and shape and location, with the unveiling of a much bigger table on Sunday, October 27th, created and built by members of this congregation, with an opportunity for all of us to claim it as our own. Friends, symbols are important. They are how we create and express meaning, what we value and what we believe. They tell the stories that define our identity, who we are and who we want to become. Look around at the symbols that surround us. What do they say about us? What does their location in the sanctuary say about us? The table means welcome and hospitality and abundance and generosity and compassion. It means inclusion and respectful diversity. Are these things we value and want people to know about us? I recently read an article about a new worshiping community in the FPC-USA that called itself the Church of the Open Table. I don't mean to intentionally raise anyone's anxiety, but I know some people around here have been talking about whether or not we should entertain a possible change to the name of this congregation. To that end, I kind of like the Church of the Bigger Table. The Church of the Bigger Table. I like that. And to God alone be all the glory. Amen.